Hello, everyone. Welcome to Azure Storage Talk, the show where we dive into latest innovations coming from Azure Storage and how different businesses can leverage them. I'm your host, Nataraj, and today's episode, we are tackling a major update from Azure Files team, the new Provision V2 billing model. To unpack what this means for IT teams, developers, and enterprises, I'm joined by Will Gries, Principal Product Manager from Azure Files team at Microsoft. We'll explore why this new model was introduced, how it compares to our previous approaches, and what real-world benefits customers are already seeing. With that, Will, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So to set the stage for the audience, give a quick background on what do you do at Microsoft? What have you been doing the last couple of years?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a product manager, actually like you. And essentially I feel like the role of a product manager is just everything that is not writing the code that actually runs the product. So it's coming up with requirements, talking to customers, coming up with strategy, doing analysis, all that kind of thing. And sometimes it's just, testing the product. Sometimes it's just reading a bunch of sort of dry docs that other companies have written and sort of trying to understand how their stuff works. And it can be a very varied day. So it's one of the things that I like about it.
Will, you're also the founding product manager of Azure Files. Is that correct?
Well, not quite. So I started in Windows Server when I started at Microsoft. So I've been at Microsoft about 11 years, just actually almost 12. And I think I started about the same week as we started Azure File Sync. And just for comparison, actually, I think that was Satya's first week as well. But I think I could claim to be a founding member of the Azure File Sync team. But the Azure Files team was sort of started by some other folks. And then, one of the things that Microsoft is famous or infamous for is doing reorgs. And so we got reorged out of Windows Server at some point and then reorged into Azure Storage. And then at some point reorged into Azure Files where it sort of made the most sense.
So let's get into it. What is Provision V2 billing model and how does it work?
Yeah. So our Provision V2 billing model is our newest, like our latest and greatest billing model that we have for Azure Files. And the basic concept is that it's a provision model. And what we mean by that is it's, sort of like, coming up with hardware on premises. Like you say up front what you want in terms of your capacity, and you pay for it whether or not you use it or not. The flip side of that is that it's extremely predictable and easy to cost. So you can price out, hey, what would 10 terabytes cost? And you know exactly what it's going to cost ahead of time. And I want to point out one other thing that's important about provision models in the cloud is unlike, actually buying hardware on premises, when you buy Azure Files, when you provision something in Azure Files, you can actually increase or decrease that at any time later on. So it's very dynamic in the sense that, hey, I wrote that I needed 10, now I actually need 20. I can just go increase the size of the share.
We already have a provision model and we're calling this Provision V2. So
yeah, I was actually just getting there. So you preempted me a little bit. So you're right. The Provision V2 model it's a very Microsoft-y name for the feature. It's our second version of a provision model. Our first version we had for SSD, and what we did was we just did a ratio between storage and then IOPS and throughput. So you would tell us, how much storage do I need? Let's say you asked for a terabyte, so 1024 gigs. We then would run that through a formula and say, based on how much you provisioned, we're going to give you a certain amount of IOPS and a certain amount of throughput. And so in this example, I happen to have the IOPS formula memorized. it's 3,000 IOPS plus 1 times every gig that you provision. So if you provision 1,024 gigs, then that means that you would get, as a baseline, 4,024 IOPS. For a lot of customers, that model is great because it's easy to know what I need in terms of storage capacity. And then I get IOPS and everything just works. But we absolutely have customers on both sides of, I need more IOPS than 4,024, and I need less IOPS than 4,024. And so what we did with the Provision v2 model is to break apart, unbundle the storage IOPS and throughput dimensions. So by default, when you go to the Azure portal and you create a new file share, you are still given a recommendation for how many IOPS and how much throughput you need. But if you actually know more than we do about what you're trying to do, like, for example, you need a lot of IOPS or a lot of throughput, or you actually don't need a lot, then you can actually change those default values to be whatever you want. So what I would say here is that the primary thing that we're doing with the Provision v2 model is that we're trying to marry the sort of flexibility with the determinism. So you always know for any provisioned quantity what it's going to cost you, but you also have a good deal of flexibility to be able to express for lots of different kinds of file shares.
So for customers who don't know what they want, what is the best way for them to get started?
Yeah. So the main thing that I recommend when a customer comes to me and doesn't quite know how to get started is to follow that recommendation that we give when you come to the Azure portal. So when you you can get this actually through the PowerShell commandlets and CLI and API and whatever, but it's very visual and easy to see on the Azure portal. So essentially, the way that it works is you go to the portal, you type in how much storage you want, and that generally is a very easy quantity for customers to reason about. And then we're going to give you a recommendation for how much IOPS and how much throughput we think that you want. And if you don't know better than what our recommendation is, our statement is to just accept the recommendation. So the way that we got to those recommendations were that we looked at the usage patterns of customers and tried to come up with formulas that matched well what the existing customer base was trying to do. And then if you later on, after you've created the share, say, well, I'd like to actually go see, based on what I've provisioned, how close am I getting to the limits? You can do that. So we integrate with Azure Monitor. On the file share, there's an Azure Monitor tab. And so you should just be able to go and look at the metrics for your file share. And you should actually even be able to plot the provisioned IOPS against the used IOPS and the provision throughput against the used throughput. And then based on those, the outcome of that sort of exercise, you can decide, hey, I actually am way over provisioned, I want to decrease, or I'm getting really close to the threshold, or maybe I've even already been throttled. And so I would like to go and increase my provisioning to make sure that I don't get throttled. So that gives that's the kind of flexibility that we're talking about here. Is not only do you have the flexibility when you create the share, but you have the flexibility later on to adjust as needed.
And can customers change the combination of capacity, IOPS, throughput anytime they want, or is there any limit on how frequently they can change it?
Yeah, so there is a limit going down. So just to say the easy case first, you can go up as much as you want to, anytime you want during the day, even if you've already gone up. Going down, we have some sort of different rules. So if you just go down and you haven't gone up, you can actually go down as many times as you want to too. But if you've gone up and then you want to go down within a 24-hour period, we only let you do that one time. So like the scenario would be if you, increase your share. I'm just going to stick on the storage dimension because it's easiest to talk about. You had your share at 10 terabytes, you increase it to 15, and then you decrease it to 10. At that point, you wouldn't be able to decrease it again until that 24-hour period had elapsed. And so it's a little bit confusing the way that that's structured. If you have any sort of questions, it's outlined in, I think, a little more detail on the Understanding Azure Files billing doc, which we'll link to later on.
So I want to go a little bit back. When you mentioned your role as product manager, and you mentioned talking to customers and understanding different problems, both inside and outside Microsoft. Can you talk about the genesis of why, introduce this new provision V2 model? What were the problems that customers were facing, and any interesting story around, why customers were looking for a different model?
Yeah, so I think actually the genesis of the provision V2 model comes from sort of two places. So we already kind of briefly touched on one, which is that, when we launched our SSD tier for Azure Files, you sometimes see us call that premium. We launched it, I think, in like 2018 timeframe. And from that initial model, we got a lot of customer feedback about like, hey, I'm having to provision a lot of storage to get the IOPS that I need or the throughput that I need. Less often, but not zero, we would get the reverse feedback like, hey, for the amount of storage I have like way too many IOPS and way too much throughput. And why are you making me pay for this, essentially? So that's, I think, probably the first place that we, sort of in our experience with the Provision V1 model, we got direct customer feedback that additional flexibility was important. The other place that I want to point out is that when we launched Azure Files originally in, I think, roughly 2014, I think we did like a public preview in 2014 and then a GA in 2015. Actually, that's before I got involved with the product. We we didn't have anything to sort of compare Azure Files to. And so the thing that was the most comparable to Azure Files was Azure Blob Storage. So if you've ever gone and looked at the traditional billing model for Azure Files, which we call pay-as-you-go, it's essentially a copy paste from the blob storage model. And so at that time, we had launched with just the one standard tier. We now call that tier transaction optimized. And then in the successive years, we've added multiple other access tiers that sort of change the ratio of storage to IOPS in terms of pricing. But a common feedback that we heard from customers with that model was that it's extremely hard to price out. And so, a few things that come to mind is like, I actually got the opportunity to go visit a customer on site, and they had been doing a POC with proof of concept with Azure Files and Azure File Sync. And the feedback that we got was like, hey, we love this. We love Azure File Sync. Azure Files is great. We'd like to go forward with this in production, but we can't. And the reason is because if I look at the spend month over month, it's actually pretty inconsistent, as whatever my line of business is has peaks and valleys of usage. And because the pay-as-you-go model uses transactions, if I do more transactions in August and less in September, that means that my bill will be more expensive in August than in September. And for this particular customer, that wasn't predictable. Like with some customers, uh, there's busy seasons. Like there's a busy season over Thanksgiving and Christmas because of Black Friday, or there's a busy season, um, in the back to school time frame or whatever. Um, but for this customer, it was unpredictable. Why is this month busy and that month not busy? We don't know. And so that's one of our motivations for moving in the provision route. I mean, that's also part of the reason we chose a provision model when we launched the SSD tier, was because of the same concern. So I guess the other thing that I would say here is, just to give credit where credit is due, we also looked a lot at what else had been done in, Azure Storage since we launched the initial sort of provision v1 for SSD and the PAYGO models, of course. And one of the things that really caught our eye is this premium SSD V2 disk model. So if you go and compare, actually, the models are very, very similar, not 100%, but like I said, credit where credit is due. It is a little bit of a copy paste from disks, intentionally so. And part of that too is so that people, when they use that, we think they'll probably use files and disks together. So it's a somewhat consistent experience between them.
And I think one of the core resonating point of Provision V2 is the price predictability, especially for companies or customers moving from on-premises to cloud. One of the big complaints is the price predictability, because cloud generally tends to promise, lower cost, but, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because if you're running a lot more workloads on cloud, you're actually paying more than what you're paying in on-premises. And sometimes, making that compelling story for customers is hard when we can't predict the price. And this sort of like fixes that problem.
Yeah, that certainly was the case in Azure. I think depending on, if you, as you look at the market, depending on when the cloud services were launched, um, there, it seems like, as just a general statement, this was sort of the evolution that was made, is like, hey, actually, the theory of the flexibility that you can get from a pay-as-you-go model is good, but actually the most important thing that customers care about is being able to tell what the costs are. And some customers are less sensitive to that than others. But at the end of the day, really, no matter whether you're a for-profit, a nonprofit, a government, a personal user, whatever, everybody has a budget. And so being able to set that budget in the form of provisioning, I think provides a much more, you know, easy to understand, easy to approach, uh, sort of experience. And then, a big part of what we've done with the Provision V2 model is give you the tools to really cost optimize the experience, to make sure that, like you say, that you actually are going to be paying less when you get the deployment off the ground.
It's also something you can do uniquely with cloud, right? Like if you compare with a customer who's on premises, and one of the compelling points is to leverage the flexibility that you get with cloud. You cannot just change your capacity or IOPS or throughput if you have an on-premises deployment that you're controlling. But now when you move to the cloud, you can actually do that. That's sort of like the goodness of the cloud that you get with this new billing model that you would otherwise not get if you just stayed on-premise.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this up front. I mean, the provision model is logically similar to buying hardware. But the advantage to using the provision model versus going and buying hardware is that you have to know ahead of time what your needs are going to be. And some customers have that down to a science. But in our experience of talking to a lot of different customers about what their storage needs are, what their costs are on-prem, and so on, um, it's very easy to think, okay, well, if I measure my current growth rate, I'm growing at X% per month, and then have that be either too much or too little when it comes time to actually run the thing for the 3 to 5 year period that you're going to run the hardware for before you upgrade. And I think, depending on what kind of hardware solution that you've purchased, it can be difficult, expensive, impossible to actually upgrade midstream. So, some solutions are easier to upgrade than others, and customers absolutely do. But there are, of course, solutions where if you run into that situation, it may just be easier to sort of upgrade earlier, and then you're sort of dealing with another capital expenditure. And so I think that's where cloud really shines, is that you're having the flexibility to say, I put this data in, I've right-sized my share, and I can continue to tweak the share as the workload changes and grows. And I'm not locked into a particular choice for the rest of time.
If you have to provide a quick mental model for customers on when to choose which billing model, what is the best way for them to like pick between which model to go for in which case?
Yeah. So I think just as a general statement, what I tell customers when I get asked this question is, really almost in all cases, you want to use the provision v2 model if you're going to do an Azure Files deployment. That's our latest and greatest. That's where our investment is going forward. And, I think when you look at the provision v1 model, there's really, I think, no significant reason except for if have an existing environment that you've already done a bunch of deployments on v1, you may want to keep everything sort of in a consistent place. But you can move to v2 and everything will just be cheaper from the start before you even tuned the IOPS and throughput. I think the situation is a little more gray, although I still think biased towards provision v2. If you are considering between PAYGO for HDD and provision v2. And the reason for that is because when you create a share on PAYGO, you're only paying for what you use. So if, for example, you have just a few config files that you need to put on a file share, and you're actually not gonna use the file share for the kind of thing that you would traditionally deploy a file server or NAS device on-prem for, then actually deploying a provision v2 HDD share could be pretty expensive because of the minimums that we enforce. So I think if you go and deploy a provision v2 HDD specifically file share, the minimums make it to be like $20 or so. Now, interestingly, this isn't the case today for the SSD file share. So the minimums there make it to be about $3.20, at least in the base region, base redundancy. So, depending on your particular workload, going for SSD provision v2, even when you don't really need SSD storage, might be a good fit. But if you really just want rock bottom pricing, like I said, just a few config files that you don't really want or need the latency, the higher, lower latency, better performance kind of guarantees on the SSD provides, the pay-as-you-go model still might be a better fit for that. And, just from looking at our customer base, there are a lot of these like really small shares, but that's not like what most customers are doing. Like most customers have bigger shares because that's what you see. That's what you do when you buy a NAS device, right? Is you make shares, you put a lot of data on them. That's what customers are mostly doing in Azure Files today. So while I don't want to discourage this model, I think these sort of small differences between pay-as-you-go and provision v2 kind of disappear once you have a sort of what I would consider a normal size file share.
Well, I guess the next step is basically try out a provision V2 billing model
Yeah.
and see if it works for your workload. Will, what is the best place for customers, audience listening here to go and explore more about provision V2 model?
So I think the best place, and I referenced it earlier, is this Understanding Azure Files Billing Guide. We can link to it in the show notes. I don't have I don't want to read out the whole URL on the chat, but that contains all of the detail that you would need to understand how the model works. In some cases, maybe more detail than you would need unless you're doing something very detailed. But it should have everything that you need to understand how the model works and be able to actually put it into production. Yeah.
Will, thanks for coming on the show, explaining all about provision V2 billing model. Yeah, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.